So good morning, everybody. My name is Amrutha Suresh. I head the Enterprise AI and go-to-market innovation at a company called Asana. So I'm based out in San Francisco Bay Area. So I'm very, very excited to be here to share my perspectives and thoughts on the topic that is very near and dear to my heart around how do you take in your AI pilots and scale that to production grade programs. And the reason I decided to talk about this topic is because, as we all know, AI is so democratized. White coding is becoming so common. There's a lot of cool ideas that's being presented around, look what I hacked. But I think what we are lacking is how do you take in these cool ideas and what constitutes an enterprise grade production scalable programs. And there's a lot of things that gets into this sort of a scaling mode. And there's a lot of gaps that when we look at the pilots and when we start thinking about what does it take for me to scale this, and that's basically what we are here to talk about. In my opinion, this is not a problem around AI, but this is a problem mostly around how we've organized our operating model in an enterprise. So basically, what we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes is why pilots fail to scale. How do you start thinking about the culture of ROI and measurement before you even think about writing a scaling strategy? And truly making AI as a part of the workflow, but not yet another tool that is sitting on a side or the periphery. And what I want to do today is to really present a program readiness checklist that's worked in my case. And I've been talking to a lot of leaders. They're sort of starting to think about the same framework. So I'm here to share that with you, which is a practical takeaway that you can put it in your toolkit and start applying it in your day-to-day. Great. With that said, I'm going to go into the next slide. Awesome. I think everybody knows this. There's a lot of studies that's being published around the topic of why pilots fail, why they can't scale to production grade programs, right? So a recent study by McKinsey said that 92% of enterprises are running AI pilots, and that's a great number. So what happens next? And there's a Gartner study that I picked up which said that only 26% of them scale beyond the pilot phase, right? And these are expensive pilots. There's a cost component, there's a lot of resourcing, time. Organization spends a lot of energy doing these pilots. So if you unpack these numbers a little bit, this is really not a failure on the technology. As I said earlier, this is really an organizational operating model that is not set up in a way that supports this. And there are three patterns that I've been seeing consistently. The first one is really the proof of concept trap. We call this a trap. This is where there's a lot of structural blind spots that a POC does not factor in when you think about a live production grade environment, right? So what is the real infrastructure constraints? How do you think about the compliance requirements? What are the types of multi-motion complexities that may come in your production system? And the organizational dynamics, the change management. There's a lot of factors that's not being thought through when you think about POC in a smaller scale, which is what we call the POC concept trap. The ROI vacuum, that's a real deal because this is a great idea. I think I can hack this. Let's white code it or build something in a small scale versus what does this mean to the enterprise? What needle is it moving? And that's like the ROI culture and the framework that we're talking about here. Quantification of what does this do to the business is a very important factor, which a lot of people don't think, which contributes to failure of the pilot to the production. And infrastructure debt, right? So this is like the plumbing problem because as I mentioned earlier, the pilot is a very small setup. So how do you sort of think about this in a scalable way when you look at this production, look at this in production? So net, the key takeaway here is we all acknowledge this, that a lot of companies are piloting, but there's a clear gap and there's a lot of things that get filtered out when you start thinking about how do I take this pilot and convert it to a production program? Before we start talking about what are the strategies, the most important framework is around the ROI thinking, because this is where, in my opinion, a lot of change needs to happen. Uh, Maybe 2 years from today, if you think about it, AI was a thing, and a lot of people were focused on how do we drive adoption. So, adoption was a very important centric metric. Now, I think we are at a stage, there's so much of maturity and so many things that have happened in the journey that adoption now is becoming a vanity metric. So you really got to think about this in different layers when you start thinking about the ROI. So I kind of use a 4-level AI ROI stack where the productivity value / adoption metric could be your very first layer. Yes, that's important, but that's not the only metric. And then we think about the process value and then the organization strategic value. And, that's where you start thinking about what does this do for my business? As I said, most teams think about the productivity value. That's fine. But again, it's very important to move away from that and start thinking about this more broadly. And on the right-hand side, I've sort of quoted an example of how do you start thinking about the vanity metric, whether it's time savings, efficiency gains, cost, which is an important factor, but more towards like the business KPI, right? If you're thinking about AI for go-to-market, like how is an AI program impacting my top line? Or how is it impacting the customer retention rate? Or for marketing, how is it helping me drive more pipeline? So things like that is something that we should start thinking about. And there's a lot of programs that I've been doing, and I've been talking to experts who are doing this, have sort of contributed to real business outcomes. So before we start putting in like a brief of what is the strategy / checklist to start thinking about scaling, the very first step is to really think about how do you sort of build this ROI framework and really identify what success looks like very early on. I think that's a very important factor. So I think this is the crux of the presentation where you start thinking about what is the operating model. We talked about this not being a technology problem. We talked about this as how do we sort of set ourselves up for success when we start thinking about identifying what are the pilots that needs to really scale as enterprise level programs. I look at this in 5 pillars, and it's all very interconnected. And if there's a gap in one pillar, then I think there's going to be a gap in your program. So it's sort of, it's all stitched together per se. The typical pattern I see is companies invest very, very heavily on pillar 3, which is the technology tools and infrastructure that make AI work. But the pattern again is pillar number 4 and 5 is very lightweight when you think about where the companies are skewing towards. And that is very, very important, because if you start thinking about your strategic intent and alignment, that's where you bring in your executive sponsorship, you make decisions on how much you're going to invest in AI. You talk about what is your North Star goal? What do you want to get out of an AI transformation program within an enterprise? The second one really is around what are like the use cases, what are the areas, where do you start thinking about applying AI first? And the third one is around how do you set up the architecture, tooling, and infrastructure? Governance and decision-making and enablement and workforce planning is sort of an under thought through areas. Typically, enterprises are 1, 2, and 3, right? That's where they operate the most, and 3 being very heavy focus. Governance and decision making, right? How do you sort of put in your policies and processes of what does a good responsible use of AI look like? What is your experimentation framework? And there's a lot of conversations around, do we buy this? Do we build this? There are purpose-built tools, like consolidation of stack is a real deal. So what is that framework on when you decide to buy versus a build? And AI council, I'm not sure how many of you all here are in companies that have an active AI council working. Call it any name, council, operating committee, like a group of subject matter experts who are very passionate about making AI work. That's a very important lever for you to, stitch all of these things together. And the 5th pillar is really, really important around How do you sort of build the literacy programs, workforce enablement around AI? And this is not a one and done. You've got to have a continuous campaign that's running for this. How do you start thinking about the role evolution and convergence? A lot of people are talking about, can AI replace human? Partly yes and partly no. So that's where you've got to think about what are the job families you have. What are the types of charter that you have assigned to every job family? How much of that can be AI-fied versus how much of real cognition and judgment is needed? And then the incoming pipeline of people, right? The workforce. How do you start thinking about the roles that you want to evolve into? So what are the types of skills that you want to be hiring for? And how do you sort of source that talent? So net, the operating model that we build for an AI transformation to stick or a pilot to program transition has to be interconnected and has to span across all of these 5 pillars. And again, they're all very interconnected. This cannot be done in a silo. And that is the mistake a lot of companies do, is that they think about this in a very siloed approach without like sort of a more horizontal preview to this. And I have a checklist that I'll show you at the end on how do you sort of take these 5 pillars and make it very tactical so you can have like a scoring rubric framework that you can borrow and start applying. So I'm just going to go a little more deeper into the 5 pillars here. The first one is around the strategic intent and executive alignment, right? So this is where it starts, because when we want to do an AI transformation, it is extremely important, one, to have a centralized vision or a shared vision, if you may. And very important North Star goals and KPIs that you got to set for yourself. And I've just given you an example of how a marketing could potentially start thinking about, a marketing function could start potentially thinking about the AI, right? Executive alignment. So please do find your executive champions. Yes, AI is very democratized and it's very bottoms up sort of a motion, but it can go until a certain extent. It cannot be sort of like an enterprise program if you're not getting the tops down alignment. And business outcomes are really, really important. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's about that maturity stage in the industry where AI is moving away from a vanity metric to start being a true KPI for the business on what outcome it's going to solve for. And super important is the investment portion of it, and this is where an alignment with the CFO or the finance person is going to be critical around how do you start budgeting for this. And when I talk about budget, it's a holistic thought process. It's just not how do you think about tool spend for AI. It's around what are the types of role that you need to make the transformation work, headcount needs, or sort of bringing things together around tooling, people, process, and technology, everything together on what are the types of investment you got to be thinking of. The second pillar we talked about is really around where do you actually start the AI transformation? And that's where we call it from a business capability lens. The first thing here is the opportunity discovery, right? As AI can be everywhere, you can do everything with AI almost. The most important thing here would be where do you start and the why. In order for you to understand that, it's super important to put together like a business capability map around what are your functional areas, what are some of the business capabilities. And if you're very familiar with that, we do different levels of capability mapping around the core capabilities and level 2 and level 3. So once you have that blueprint, you're going to have some sort of a jobs to be done canvas where you think about within this capability, here's what the current state looks like in terms of the value delivery, and then start thinking about what are the friction areas in this value chain or value delivery. And then you've got to have some sort of a rubric or a scoring framework around how much of a pain is it and how frequently is this pain happening and can AI solve for this? Because at a surface level, AI can solve for everything, but when you truly unpack this, it's probably not a good candidate where you can derive full value from AI. And that's why this opportunity discovery stage of putting in some sort of a heat map or a rubric around why is going to be very important. And that's where you kind of start your genesis of here are the areas and here's why it's important. And time to number one is number two around ROI identification. I think in my previous couple of slides ago, we talked about this ROI framework and moving away from vanity metric. This is a slightly deeper version of that, where when you look at an area and you identify this is the area that I want to AI-fy, here is what I'm going to get out of it, and here's the impact and outcome. So sort of tying that at a very micro level would be really important. And we talk about the pilots to program scaling framework, right? This is where you got to start thinking about it like a mini program or a project where you have sort of a time boxed approach of I'm going to use this use case and measure this value, and I'm going to time box this for about a month and a half with certain people. And then I'm going to look back and look at the criteria of how did the pilot scale, what value did it deliver, and then eventually start thinking about like a scaling strategy. And then the value measurement obviously cannot be around like the retrospect. It has to be a continuous process, right? When you think about the AI initiatives in production, we run it like a portfolio where we have regular reviews, where we look at the impact on a very regular basis, not just after we complete the program. So that way it is like more of a continuous ongoing sort of a feedback loop. Pillar 3 and Pillar 4 around the infrastructure and governance. So we talked about the foundational infrastructure model. So when we think about the enterprise-wide AI transformation, there's a lot of standardization we do on the toolings and the models, which a lot of people here, I'm assuming, are familiar with. And we also start thinking about, okay, a maturity assessment is really important for your organization around where you are from an AI transformation standpoint, and how do you sort of go into that agentic sort of a path forward around what architecture you're going to be designing that for. We do a lot around the MCP strategy, role-based access controls, around if you are in, for example, sales, like how do you start thinking about the right tools and permissions for you to be interacting so you can derive a lot of value with a connected ecosystem. And the last one that I'm going to touch upon very briefly here is the enterprise data and context. A lot of the leaders here, I'm sure, are familiar that context is the most important sort of a construct for AI to work. So really investing in data pipelines, a connectivity around your integration ecosystem, and how clean is your data. Especially, I work a lot on the go-to-market side, and when we start thinking about building something for sales, we invest heavily in terms of a dependency for something like an AI program to work, for the data to be clean. The constant feedback that I get is, okay, this is all very cool stuff, so how do I trust the quality of the output? So for that, you got to make sure you have like a decent data structure and clarity and hygiene that you're feeding into your AI model or program for it to really work and gain the confidence of the end user. The fourth pillar that I want to touch upon, which we briefly talked about, is the governance and decision making, and a little bit of unpacking around what the AI council structure looks like, in my opinion, is one, executive sponsor, which ties back to the very first pillar we talked about on having this be tops down. So we do a lot of quarterly sort of a QBR style meetings with the executive leadership team to really showcase the business value of what AI programs are doing in the company. And then obviously for every function, we have our functional leaders who are CMO, CRO, and Chief Customer Officer, and our product leaders. And then I'm responsible for running the program office here, where we have, for the revenue marketing side of things, we have the GTM engineering sort of a role. We have FDEs who are working on other more broader corporate functions and AIification of that. And we have a mini ops team, which sort of pulls all of this together. And I also have product managers. And practitioners are basically your AI council experts or members who are the subject matter experts or domain experts within the functions. And very important to take in their feedback to sort of factor in the framework that we're talking about. Again, if you are a centralized organization that's having the enterprise AI transformation as a charter, you need not be experts in everything. And that's where the relationships that you develop in a pod model, so that's how we operate here, is going to be really important, because you're sourcing the information, intelligence, and the domain knowledge that these experts have to make things work together. And that's why it's super important to have that shared goal at the top, because when you go to these people, the obvious question is what is in it for me? Why do I make this a priority? So having the sort of a shared goal helps build that sort of a pod model where everybody are moving towards one win in the same direction. And a bit around the policies that I want to talk about is, given that AI is just so everywhere and democratized, it's really, really important of publishing the do's and don'ts on what does the responsible use of AI look like. And this is potentially a partnership with the info security team, the legal folks, and the IT folks to pull together what works for your enterprise in terms of the responsible AI usage policy. Of course, some regulated industries are pretty strict on these rules. So again, depending on which industry you operate in, what type of company you belong in, this can differ. And then what we also do is through the AI Council, we activate the experimentation framework around if somebody is interested in trying out a new AI tool, what is it that they should follow? How do they get like a fast track approval? How do they build a hypothesis around what do they want to accomplish? What is the criteria for setting a baseline metric and a metric that they want to see after they run the pilot? And we're pretty strict about this in terms of if you don't have the right governance, we would not be supporting that program. So not trying to police this, but I think having a sort of formalized process which is going to make life better for everybody and really enable them to do good work, which can add meaningful value. And then a lot of conversations around build and buy, as most of you are aware of here, is when do I buy something versus when do I build something? When do I make a decision on, we have so many tools, when can I turn on the AI capability of the tool and what is the process for that? So we do publish a general guideline around when you start thinking of build and when you start thinking of a buy. And that has been really useful. Of course, that is a very general guideline that we publish. We obviously that becomes more customized based on your function, based on your use cases, but at least it's a good conversation starter and helps people to start thinking in a direction. And then we typically bring these conversations to the AI Council where we discuss that. The reason this is important is there's a lot of redundancy and tool sprawl that is also happening with AI. And this sort of helps the conversation and this shared knowledge sort of helps avoid some of those things. Because, for example, there could be somebody in marketing trying to do something and somebody in sales trying to do something. And they're probably trying to buy redundant tools for the same use case. So that's why bringing these pieces together with the right governance and policies will really help avoid these situations. And with the interest of time, I'm going to quickly run through this. Again, enablement and workforce transformation. So there's a lot of roles that are changing, right? The role convergence and evolution is a real thing with AI. So number one is functional enablement, using your champions to really train people on how do the AI find the use cases for the function. The second one is around workforce planning, around looking at your job families, what are the type of roles, and where is the delta when you think about the AI transformation and how these roles need to be evolving, and what are the type of roles that need to be coming in. And number three is around the hiring and talent strategy, around what are the types of role that you got to be looking at. And I've typically found a lot of success in hiring from non-traditional paths. Not, yes, posting the job on your rec is one important thing, but really tapping into the communities very specifically, and then more around like, how are the builders doing in this community? Is this builder the right person for my team? So that's sort of, I tap into a lot of these pockets, which is not a very traditional path of sourcing new talent to the company. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a one and done. It has to be a campaign style, which is always on, where the workforce feels that they have all the support to keep up to everything that's going on in terms of the pace of change. And One thing that I really wanted to share with the audience here is the program readiness checklist, right? So the topic that we came in was how do we sort of think about the operating system change for pilots to program transition. So this is the 5 pillars that we talked about, and I've like very specific tactics within the 5 pillars, which is just an example rubric. And it's really, really important for you to start looking at each of the boxes that's here and then scoring or rating yourself. And the scoring guide that I typically use is if it is less than about 12, then there's work for you to do. You're not ready for like a transformation per se. Focus on getting those areas more mature. And then if it's between 12 to sort of 17, there are gaps for you to like really fix. So go after those specific areas. But if you are on the higher range, which is about 18 to 20, you check most of the boxes here, then I think you're ready to scale. You take in the right programs, identify what those are, and then start thinking through how do you make this more enterprise available /GA. And quickly, what do you do? So when you get in Monday morning at work, run your checklist like now, this week. Define one hard ROI metric per AI use case, which is really, really important. Look at who should be a part of your AI council and put a clear charter for the AI council, because this is not a job that you can do alone. You're going to be the leading person doing this, but you got to use experts who are the council members. And then start thinking about in the next month or so, if you don't have a team or you're building a team, start thinking about your product manager for AI or an FTE or an engineer on what the job description should look like. So this is like a practical application that you can use with the framework that I showed you earlier and the scorecard, and then start applying that right away.